there are two Irans. There is one Iran as a nation state, an Iran that is the creator of culture, has a positive attitude to life, has always has that. Is a optimistic nation. It is a forward-looking nation. It's a nation that has lived in peace with its neighbors for centuries. Then there is another Iran, which is the Iran of darkness, the Iran of terrorism, the Iran of low-intensity warfare against virtually all of our neighbors, a kind of Jekil and Hyde situation. Dr. Jekil, you know, in normal life, is a very nice man. He helps everybody. He prevents cruelty to weak people. But when he becomes Mr. Hyde, he becomes a killer. And of course, this split personality is not limited to Iran's experience. It has happened to other countries in history. For example, in the early 19th century, the problem that Europe had was not with France as a nation state. It was with Napoleon as the leader of a self-styled revolution that wanted to conquer the world. The problem that the world had with Germany was not with the German nation, but with Hitler and with Nazism. The problem that the world had was with Bolshevism, not with the Russian people as a nation. The same thing is happening in Iran today, and it is very important for the outside world to understand the reality, this dual reality of Iran. When when people talk of let's hit Iran, which of the two Iran you want to hit? When people talk of let's talk to Iran, which of the two Iran you want to talk to? So this duality of Iran's existence has led to a constant struggle between divergent and contradictory interests that prevent us from developing a national strategy. On every single issue of domestic and foreign policy, Iran is in a cul-de-sac, is in an impasse, cannot go anywhere. Of course, as soon as you speak of regime change in Iran, people say, you want the Americans to invade Iran and create another Iraq and so on. At the outset, I must say that I don't want the Americans to invade Iran or anybody to invade Iran. In fact, I didn't want the Americans to invade Iraq either. I wanted Saddam Hussein to go, and when the Americans did enter Iraq, I supported them. But before that, I did not ask anybody to invade Iraq, and I'm not asking anybody to invade Iran. What I'm asking is to realize that this regime is unreformable, and there are many regimes in history that have been unreformable, because the political DNA of this regime is programmed in such a way that it must behave as it does. When you talk to some so-called Iran experts, they say, if we could manage to change the behavior of the Islamic regime, then we would be happy. But you behave as you are. As Aristotle said, character is action. You are what you do. There are not two different things. You cannot do something and be somebody else. The scorpion stings you not because he wants to be a bad boy. He is programmed to sting you, and you can't help it. This is why the present Iranian regime, even if you had the men of goodwill in position in Tehran, and some of them are men of goodwill. I don't want to condemn everybody. It's the context, the structure of this regime that turns it into Mr. Hyde. With no amount of goodwill in the world could you reform this regime. And there have been many other regimes, like could you reform Robespierre's regime? You couldn't. Could you reform Hitler's regime? Could you reform Stalin's regime? Could you reform Kim Il-sung's regime? Could you reform Robert Mugabe's regime? You can't. Could you reform Omar al-Bashir's regime? You can't. So if the present regime were to behave in a different way, it would be a different regime. Of course, sometimes it happens. In history, there are always exceptions to the rule. For example, one case is the case of China. China achieved regime change by changing its course. But the reason was that the Chinese were very badly defeated in a war with the Soviets. They found themselves sandwiched between the Soviets, the Americans, the Japanese, the Indians, surrounded by enemies. They decided to change course. Mao Zedong was sick and too busy playing with teenage girls. Lin Piao was assassinated. The Gang of Four disappeared. There was what the Arabs call Taqaran al-Sa'dain, which means the coincidence of good omens. And China could change and become something slightly different. But the Islamic Republic, as it is incapable of doing that. On every single issue, whether of domestic politics or foreign politics, everything is suspended. Everything is in the air. It is years that the littoral nations of the Caspian Sea are trying to negotiate an accord to use the natural resources of the sea. They can't do it because the Islamic Republic cannot develop a position. It cannot because, Mr. Hyde and Mr. Jekyill, Dr. Jekyill are constantly fighting. If they act in accordance with the interests of the revolution, they will harm the interests of the nation. The other way, they would harm their revolution. On every single issue of domestic politics is the same. They speak of privatization, they can't do it. They speak of decentralization, they can't do it. Because always Dr. Jekyill stands against Mr. Hyde. The Islamic Republic's biggest misfortune was its inability to destroy the structures of the Iranian state. The Iranian state is a very old and well-established state with a history of about 500 years at least, since the emergence of the Safavid state. And we know in today's world there are not many countries that are that old as state structures. There are 198 members of the UN today, but when the UN came into being, there were 43 countries, and Iran was one of them. If you look at in Europe, for example, the only old regimes here are France and Britain and maybe Castile or Spain. So when the Islamic Revolution came to power, one of its first ambitions was to destroy the Iranian state completely and replace it with their own Islamic state. They failed to do that because the Iranian state was very strong and because the Islamic ideology was very weak. As a result, they created a parallel society. There was an Iranian army, they created the Revolutionary Guards. There were Iranian courts of justice based on the Napoleonic Code. They created Islamic revolutionary courts. There was a police. They created the Comité. And this parallelism continues to this day and prevents the regime from functioning even as an ordinary government. The split, as a result, is that you have a very peculiar situation, rather rare in the modern world, in which the Iranian society seems to be in one orbit and the Iranian government seems to be in another orbit. All the production of culture and economics, and the real history of humanity on the side of the Iranian society escapes the control of the Iranian regime. So you have people who control the levers of power, the coercive forces at their disposal, but fail to control a very vibrant and dynamic society which is doing its own thing. They force people to pray in public, but they cannot stop people from partying in private. Before the revolution, we used to have Islamic writers and poets and philosophers. Today we don't have any. Suddenly, virtually the whole of Iranian culture, including the part that use a veneer of religion, is secularized, not to say westernized. This is the basis of my analysis that the potential for change in Iran exists.